Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video on Grombrindal. This is to celebrate his general release in the next couple of days. I know some of you may have already played with him if you got the promotion through the Games Workshop, but I thought I'd do a lore video just to inform any of those picking him up in the next couple of days as free LC what Grombrindal's all about. So let's get on with it, shall we? So, Grombrindal is otherwise known as the White Dwarf, and he has long been a kind of mascot for Games Workshop and the Games Workshop magazine, which is called the White Dwarf. As such, there's been many sort of iterations of his model and what he looks like, being, as you can see up there on the top right, even a pirate at times. My particular favorite model is the one that you'll see in sort of the bottom right, of him being carried upon two shields by Gotrek and Joseph Bugman, who are two other very famous dwarven characters who I will probably get into in a future video, but I think that model's probably my favorite one and a really good one. But yeah, he's taken many different iterations over the years and many different forms, but the idea is essentially that Grombrindal is a kind of mythic hero of the dwarves. Whenever the dwarves are outnumbered, if they're surrounded by goblins, bang, Grombrindal appears. If they're sort of surrounded and like there's nothing to see and like a Karak's surrounded by Skaven and there's only 100 people defending a massive Karak and all is doomed, haha, fear not. Grombrindal's been here all along. I shall protect you guys and we shall fight together. Very much a sort of reverse Superman analogy. Sort of, is that a dove? Is it a snowball? Is it a tiny snowman? No, it's Grombrindal. That's kind of the idea behind him. He appears where dwarves are in trouble and his help is needed. Now, it has long been hypothesized, and I don't think it's ever been officially confirmed by Games Workshop, but the idea is that Grombrindal, the White Dwarf, is essentially a dwarf called Snorri Whitebeard, who was the first High King of the Dwarves. Now, Snorri was alive a very long time ago. He was the child of what have now become known as two ancestor gods. So dwarves who lived a long time ago have become revered and recognized as ancestors now. His father was a god called Grungni. Now, he is the god of metalworking, of stoneworking, of mining, of all these very important things in dwarven society, and is regarded as the most powerful of the ancestor gods, teaching dwarves how to work the sort of stone around them and forge metal into weapons and runes and that kind of thing. His mother is believed to be Valea. She is the goddess, the ancestor goddess of brewing, of the homestead, of the rules of dwarven society. Now, I believe Valea actually had two husbands, but Grungi was the main one. I also think she had married his brother, but let's not dive into that in this video. Essentially, what we need to know is that about 7,500 years before the current sort of Warhammer state of affairs where the game kicks off, the dwarves existed, and Grungi had a vision that a great threat was about to arrive and that they need to make their homes deep within the mountains, and that's where they built all their Karaks and took shelter deep beneath the earth. And sure enough, at some point something happens called the Chaos Storm, which is where chaos energy is released upon the world. I'm not going to get the exact reasons about why that happened in this video, but just suffice it to say that essentially, sort of demons are roaming free across the surface of the world. This is when the beast men are born. They're mutated from either men or animals. I'm not sure which first, chicken or the egg. Men or animals mutated into beast men. As I say, yeah, demons are roaming freely. The world just turns into an apocalyptic nightmare. But the dwarves were safe deep beneath the earth inside their Karaks. And they eventually came out and emerged and started fighting chaos. And initially, the ancestor gods were part of that fight, but at some point they disappear. Towards the end of the entire conflict and chaos, essentially, I think the ancestor gods really greatly contribute to stemming the first initial eruption, and it kind of ebbs, but then it picks up again, and chaos re-emerges into the world in sort of a second eruption of chaos. And sort of during that eruption, I think the ancestor gods disappear. But Grungi and his wife Valea leave their firstborn son, Snorri Whitebeard, in charge, after, in fact, Grungi himself carved the Power Throne, which is the throne that Thorgrim sits on to this day. So the dwarves are still fighting chaos throughout the land at this point, and at some point they fight chaos, and during a battle at somewhere, I think it's towards the around sort of Barak Var, that kind of area, they fight chaos into the lowlands and to the coast at some point, and there they bump into an elven fleet. Now, they've never encountered the elves before. They're not sure if these are agents of chaos or what the deal is with these elves. And likewise, the elves are apprehensive of them. But during this initial encounter, a horde of beastmen attack both of these parties. And they have to sort of fight back to back to survive and forge very good friendship. And so that's how first contact with the elves is made. Now, they start to work on sort of cooperative military action against chaos, looking to stop the flow of chaos in the world once and for all. And during some of these military actions, Snorri meets a prince, an elven prince, called Malekith. Now, Malekith is the son of the Phoenix King, and it is in fact the first Phoenix King at this point. So there hasn't been a Phoenix King before him, and as you may or may not know, the elves in Warhammer lore are immortal, much like in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings lore. They, like, age doesn't affect them, but an axe to their head will kill them still. But they meet Malekith and the dwarves, and the elves army march north, start fighting back the tides of chaos, and eventually they fight at a battle of Carrick Val, which is slightly north of the sort of northernmost Carrick you see in the world map as it stands at the moment in Total War Warhammer of Carrick Ungor. And they fight a colossal battle there. Snorri Whitebeard and Malekith are back to back, fighting as brothers, fighting against the tide of chaos. And it's very, very sort of beneficial to both parties. They forge huge and lasting friendships. And it's at this point that mostly chaos is dealt with. It's contained in the north. It's not a huge threat at the moment. And this is when the golden age for both the dwarven and elven empires begin. The elves begin to colonize the old world. They make it sort of up to the World Edge Mountains, but they don't sort of encroach on the dwarves' territory in the mountains. They start a lot of colonies, places like where Marienburg is now. They had a city. A lot of Bretonnian cities are based on some of these old world colonies that the elves had. And really, they go on to forge a fantastic and lasting friendship that greatly expands the powers of both civilizations. And neither will be at the peak they reach in this period. At some point after the sort of towards the end, or just after the tide of chaos has been stemmed, Arion, I believe his name is Arion, the first Phoenix King, sort of the king of the elves at the time, disappears. And Malekith, being his eldest born son, is amongst the front runners to be his replacement as the Phoenix King. Now, Malekith has primarily been a general for this whole time. He's been fighting chaos. It's all he's been doing for years. He does have a bit of a temper, and because he's a general and he's just been fighting chaos and he has this temper, the elven princes who tend to sort of elect the next Phoenix King or the next High Ruler of the elves decide that, no, Malekith, you're a bit too hot-headed for this king business. We're going to give it to another guy. And the guy they select is a guy called Belshazzar. And they think that Belshazzar will be a much better sort of peacetime ruler than Malekith would be. But they do put Malekith in charge of the elven army. Now, Malekith's greatly admired amongst his troops. He's a proven general over and over, and he's a fantastic fighter in his own right. He'll stand there with them on the front line, holding back the tides. Really a sort of leader by example, and well admired and respected amongst all the elven army. But at this point, sort of Malekith's like, okay. Now, new High King, do you want to come and meet our friends, the Dwarves? And together, the High King, Belshazzar, and Malekith go and meet Snorri. Because I think Malekith, having known Snorri for a while, acts as sort of an introductory aspect to the meeting. And in that meeting, Belshazzar presents Snorri with a wonderful gift of something called Illyrian wine. Now, this wine is probably centuries old, of a beautiful vintage, of such fine and sort of respected and great flavor, that its value is astronomical. A single glass of this stuff would bankrupt most elven lords. But Snorri, having received a barrel of it, wanted to show his appreciation in a very dwarf-like way. So he immediately grabs an axe and smashes in the top and downs an entire barrel of Illyrian wine, spilling huge quantities of it down his beard, down his front, on the floor, but really sort of chugs the most expensive wine in the known world in front of this royal elven delegation. Now, the Book of Honor, which records this incident for the dwarves, doesn't really sort of state the reaction that the elves had at the time, but one can imagine it was probably one of innate shock. I think could safely say. But despite this, and despite the cultural differences, the friendship goes on to be a lasting one, and one forged in sort of the fires of war, as it were. And they continue to have a very prosperous relationship between the two civilizations. Now, knowing that Malekith and Snorri get on quite well, the new High King of the Elves, Bel-Shanaar, says, okay, Malekith, you stay here and be ambassador with the dwarves with our continuing friendship and relationship. And Malekith's like, okay, seeming to have taken the whole losing out on being King of the Elves thing in his stride. So a few sort of centuries or decades passed, and eventually dwarves, unlike elves, are not immortal. Dwarves do pass away eventually. And so Snorri gets old, and he's on his deathbed. And he says to Malekith, my friend, please swear an oath to me that as long as you're alive, you'll do everything in your power to ensure that elves and dwarves remain long friends forever. And as my little slip up there, mentioning dark elves might hint, this may not be the case. So Malekith agrees, and he makes an oath. He swears to Snorri that he'll do this. But Malekith, even at this point, having missed out on the throne of the elves, has been plotting his revenge all along. So Malekith, after the death of Snorri, returns to elven society and starts a civil war amongst the elves. He kills Bel-Shanaar through poisoning, and there's a whole sort of lot of political intrigue, but I'm not going to get into exactly what went on in this video. That's maybe for another video. But essentially, what happens is Malekith is defeated. He's exiled from elven society. He takes up residence in a place called Nagaroth, which is to the northwest of Ulthuan, which is the home of the elves. So he's lost this civil war. He's not king. He's embittered. He's angry. He's tried a couple of things as sort of last-ditch efforts to try and both end the world and get revenge on the elves, but they've all been foiled by the elves. And so Malekith thinks up another idea. He decides to start a war between the elves and the dwarves. Now, what he does to do this is around the year negative 2005 by the imperial calendar, so around 4,500 years before the current Warhammer world. And the way that the imperial calendar works is it's counting up to the arrival of Sigmar, who's the god of the empire. But essentially about 4,500 years before current events, Malekith sends a group of his now entitled Dark Elves to the Dwarven lands and says, look, guys, I want you to raid and murder Dwarven trade caravans, Dwarven settlements, whatever you think makes a prime and juicy target. Kill as many dwarves as you can, and do it all in our old regalia, in the old sort of clothes of the elves that we wore when we were one elven society. And so they do this. They start to commit this subterfuge and start murdering dwarves. And the dwarves are incensed. They can't understand what's going on because the dwarves haven't been told there was a civil war amongst the elven civilization. The elves are too proud to admit that they had a civil war. There was an uprising. That their society is now split in two. They just didn't tell the dwarves anything about it. And so the dwarves start sending people, and they start sending messages to there's now a new High King, I think a king called Calador. and they start sending messages to Caledor, the new High King of the Elves, saying, "What's going on? Why are you killing our people?" And the Elves being quite skeptical and not really clocking on to the fact that it might be Malekith behind it. Just say like, "There's no Elves attacking you. Don't be silly. You're not telling us the truth. You're just trying to get some money out of us," or something like that. And so at some point, it just becomes a last straw. And so the Dwarven king at the time, since Snorri passed, I believe it's a guy called Grombeck Starbreaker. I think that's right. Do tell me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I think that's right. And he sends sort of a group of emissaries and an ambassador to the Elves to plead with the High King to say, "Look, this is happening. Here's like evidence. Our people are being slain by Elves. Here's testimony. Please, can you investigate this? Otherwise, we have to hold the throne accountable, which is you, Caledor." And Caledor, trying to not look weak in his new position and making, frankly, an idiotic decision, decides to grab the dwarf emissaries and shaves them all and sends them back to Karazakarak. Now, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but shaving a dwarf is pretty much the worst thing you can do to him. Worse than killing him, almost. It completely shames him. He essentially needs to sort of leave dwarven society, and indeed, many of the emissaries end up taking something called the Slayer Oath, which is much like sort of the sort of Black Watch, as it were, in Game of Thrones, where they're essentially dead to dwarven society, but need to sort of die in a kamikaze-like way by defending dwarven society in their shame. And this is what slayers are, essentially. And so, having said that, having sent them back, the dwarves go to war. The Dwarven High King's been left with little other choice than to go to war. So this is what begins an era known as the War of the Beard, as the Elves called it, the War of Revenge, which is what the Dwarves call it, and the War of the Ancients, which is what the humans called it. Now, these are two world powers at the peak of their powers, and they just begin mass slaughtering each other. Essentially, the dwarves start to win in the old world, so they start to drive the elves back from their colonies, but these are only sort of satellite colonies. It's not like the dwarves are going to get to Ulthuan, which is the island capital of elven society, but they managed to drive the elves back all the way to their last settlement, and this is around. So this war lasts around 500 years. So now we're looking around the year minus 1560. So around 4,000 years before current Warhammer times. And they drive them back to their last colony, which is a place called Tor Alessi, which, as many of you might recognize now on the Total War Warhammer map as Longyi, which is the colony in the first Bretonnian province, on the north-western side of Bretonnia. It's their secondary colony, not their main capital, I don't think. And so eventually the dwarves win this battle. It's called the Battle of the Three Towers. And here's a depiction of it here, with the sea in the background. And essentially here, the dwarves killed Caledor, the High King, at the time. So leaderless, the elves retreat back to Ulthuan, and the dwarves have won, as it were, the War of the Beard. They never set sail across the ocean to chase the elves to their homeland. They just leave it at having driven them from the old world. Now you may say, but what about the wood elves? And you would be right. The wood elves were a group of elves who took shelter in Lotharen Forest, which you'll know very well from the campaign map. And they started their relationship with the forest spirits, where they protect the forest spirits protect them. It became a very symbiotic relationship, but they also declared their independence from elven society as a whole, and just said they'll rule themselves from the woods. But as far as sort of the high elf culture was concerned, they'd been driven completely from the old world. Now, at the end of this war, we say the dwarves won, but both empires are shadows of their former selves. They've lost so many soldiers in this war that lasted some 500 to 600 years. where they were millions, there's now hundreds of thousands. It's just it's decimated their populations, it's decimated their warriors, it's decimated their infrastructure. And essentially what happens is, from the Dwarven perspective, is that the Dwarves are now weak. So this is where you get like Skaven now coming in and taking over some of the old Dwarven territories. You get the Goblins coming in and claiming places like Carrick Eight Peaks. And it's just a slow grinding down of the peak of the Dwarven Empire, simply because they no longer have the resources to fight off these threats anymore. These threats which would have been considered just non-entities, just that could have been wiped out in a matter of a couple of years, have now been dogging the Dwarves for nearly 4 millennia, because they are a shadow of their former selves. Now, because this war was started by Malekith, this is what gave rise, and where we have the phrase, oh, that would make them turn in their grave. If you upset someone who holds grudges like a dwarf can, it didn't only make Snorri Whitebeard, or Grombrindal as we now know him, turn in his grave. It made him rise from the dead. He came back to life, is the idea behind Grombrindal the White Dwarf. And now he serves the Dwarven people where he can, but he's so enraged with Malekith that he wants to see himself avenged upon Malekith. Malekith is responsible for the destruction of the Dwarven Empire as it once stood at its golden pinnacle. And Grombrindal will not rest until that failed oath that Malekith took, that promise he made Snorri Whitebeard, is avenged, essentially. I dropped the word I was thinking of, but yeah, until that broken vow, that grudge is settled. Now, if you think Thorgrim could hold a grudge, my God, being able to come back from the dead because of a grudge, I think that's a proper grudge holder there. And that's what allows Grombrindal to make an appearance in Total War Warhammer today. I hope that video was helpful for all you guys. I had a lot of fun making it. I like Grombrindal. I love the character. I love the idea behind the character, that he's a dwarf who can hold a grudge so badly he literally comes back from the dead to settle it. As I say, though, it could just be he's a guy with a white beard. We don't know. Games Workshop has never confirmed it. There have been hints here and there, and I think it's now mostly widely accepted that Grombrindal is Snorri Whitebeard, who doesn't obviously want to call himself Snorri. I don't think he wants to take over the throne from Thorgrim or anything like that, but he just tries to make himself useful to the elves, to the dwarves, sorry, as long as he can, until he can avenge himself upon Malekith. Now, I think the Dark Elves will be introduced in the second iteration of the game, which a lot of people have hypothesized is coming out towards the back end of this year. And I really hope they come back and revisit Grombrindal's stats and maybe give him something that sort of like hatred against Dark Elves or something like that, that you can really see this grudge, this, I think, 7,500, or actually maybe 5,000 year grudge settled at long last when they meet on the battlefield. Grombrindal versus Malekith. That would be a fight for the ages, and I look forward to playing that one out in my version of Total War Warhammer. Well, if you guys enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see a few more. I am planning on doing another Dwarf legendary lore orientated video in the next couple of days, as again an ongoing celebration of the release of Grombrindal to the general public as a part of Free LC. But as I said, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks very much for listening.